What is up, everyone? Today we have a very fun video which is brought to you by a request from a tier 3 patron, hello from Ian, who asked that I make a video about overlooked Stax pieces. So thank you so much, Ian, for the recommendation and continued support. It really does mean so much. When I made this video, I had no idea just how many Stax cards are played in less than 10,000 decks. There were over 50 cards that made the short list of cards that I was like, I like that effect, but I don't have enough time to be covering all of them today. However, I am starting something new moving forward where I will take all of the bonus cards that barely didn't make the cut and I'll make a 5 to 10 minute bonus video covering all those cards in an honorable mention style video. I'm going to be posting those videos on Patreon as a thank you to my tier 2 and tier 3 patrons. Crazy enough, for this video, there were 28 cards that didn't make the cut. So things like Smoke, Mist of Stagnation, which is a great asymmetrical Stax piece for graveyard decks. There's things like Energy Flux, Storage Matrix, and 24 others that I really liked, but like I said, just didn't make the cut in this video. I want to offer more for my tier 2 and tier 3 patrons, so moving forward, you'll get 4 to 5 of these bonus extended cut videos each month, including the first one, which is now live on Patreon. The link is in the description if you're interested in checking it out, but thanks so much to everyone who does help support me in creating content. As always, we're going to start this off with honorable mentions of cards that I liked but aren't going to quite get the full in-depth coverage. So first up is Meekstone, which is a 1-mana artifact that prevents creatures with power 3 or greater from untapping, which makes it really good in low to the ground creature decks or token decks. Crackdown is a similar effect, but it's asymmetrical and benefits white decks in particular. Next up is Locust Miser, which is in 7,310 decks. This is just a pesky Stax piece, which prevents opponents from having 7 cards in hand and can be very annoying for decks that are drawing a lot of cards. Aether Barrier sees play in 4,000 decks and makes someone pay the Rhystic Study 1 tribute each time they cast a creature, or else they need to sacrifice a permanent. Interestingly though, some decks could actually use this as a sacrifice outlet for some of the more hard to remove permanents. Nether Void is in 3,190 decks and counters all spells unless the owner pays 3 generic mana. Honestly, this could have made the actual list, but it's $600, so not really applicable to most people who are watching this. Kill Switch is an interesting Stax piece that can do work against treasure decks and artifact strategies in general. Mindlock Orb prevents people from searching their libraries, but there's so many other cards that have this type of effect tied onto it, in addition to other abilities, so it doesn't really see that much play. And one more honorable mention for our rich friends out there, or proxiers, is in the Eye of Chaos, which counters instants unless the player pays X, where X is the converted mana cost. This card is currently sitting at $130, but it can be really effective at countering a lot of the free counter spells where you just pitch a card that's blue and you're able to cast it for free. Now, getting to the actual cards that we're going to be covering today, the most played card that we'll talk about today is Solemnity, which sees play in 30,100 decks, or just 0.89% of decks that can play it. This card is a 3-mana enchantment. It costs 2 generic and 1 white and says, players can't get counters. And counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. So this card is pretty cool and can either hose some decks entirely or just be a little nuisance here and there, but not necessarily the biggest pain in the butt for decks that aren't running those dedicated strategies. So from a player perspective, this goes really good against infect decks or experience counter decks. And in terms of the actual permanents that this lists out, it can go hard against charge counters or also +1/+1 counter decks, obviously saga decks, and also proliferate decks that aren't planeswalker focused can all be really impacted by this card. But what I think is really interesting about this in particular is that not only is this a nice Stax against prominent strategies in the format, there's also a lot of things you can do with this card in an offensive way. The classic being with Dark Depths, where you get an immediate Merit Lage token. You can go on Infinite Sacrifice or ETB or LTB trains if you play this with Luminous Broodmoth and a creature that doesn't naturally have flying, so that you can just keep sacrificing it. It doesn't get flying, and then, you know, how that would work. You can also use this with Delaying Shield to not take any damage while both of these are on the field. And depending on the level of degeneracy that you're aiming for, you could also play this in Decree of Silence to effectively lock your opponents out of the game entirely outside of non-counterable spells or channel effects like Boseiju Who Endures. People who do choose to play this card likely aren't planning to put any counters on their own permanents, or else this would be a non-bow. So this is all likely upside if you do plan to use this, because there's probably not a lot in the 99 that will be disrupted by playing this. And in fact, many could play this specifically as like a secret commander to see how many different cards you could play that gets benefited when you don't put on counters, like a cumulative upkeep deck. Next up, we have War's Toll, which is a 4-mana enchantment that costs 3 generic and 1 red. This says, whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, tap all lands that player controls. If a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attack if able. So obviously this is a very nice resource disruption Stax piece that requires someone to go all in if they're going to tap a land for mana. This can be a huge nuisance against control decks and decks that run heavy interaction, because people tend to save their mana for cheaper spells to play on an opponent's turn. Then, you know, when you're playing against this, the control player needs to be careful to not tap their lands on their turn, or else their entire mana pool is just going to be emptied outside of mana rocks. So forcing someone's hand in one single phase where they have to spend all of their mana or else it's just going to be lost can be really frustrating to play against. And if that first Stax piece ability wasn't nice enough, there is also the second part, which requires all-ins if someone is going to attack, which leaves them open for attacks, assuming they don't have creatures with summoning sickness or things that didn't attack. This requirement to go all in if you attack will likely prevent people from going in for chip damage here and there, and will also naturally prolong the game in that perspective, which is what a lot of Stax pieces tend to do naturally anyways. And one of the craziest parts about this card is that it is asymmetrical. Like, it says whenever an opponent taps a land, or whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, so you are unaffected. This is also an enchantment, so it's a lot sturdier than other permanent types out there. I'm curious if you have any guesses as to the top commanders playing this. I didn't really give you that much time to think about it, but Yurlok of Scorched Thrash and Zozu the Punisher are the top commanders playing this, and Bellow Bard of the Brambles is also up there in the top 5. This doesn't really surprise me. People don't really throw in Stax pieces unless they're going all in on the Stax strategy. Our third card today is Spirit of the Labyrinth, which is in 23,500 decks as well. This is a 2-mana enchantment creature spirit that is a 3/1. It costs 1 generic and 1 white, and it says each player can't draw more than 1 card each turn. Alright, short and sweet. This is an anti-draw Stax piece, which is played in less than 1/7 of the amount of decks as the game changer Narset Parter of Veils. This by no means is nearly as close to being as brutal as Narset, and is much fairer because it also hits you, like you can't draw more than 1 each turn, and it is also a creature, so it is much more susceptible to removal, but there are a few things that are going for it. First of all, this only costs 2 mana, which is a good rate for such a powerful effect like this. Second, this is an enchantment as well, so it is fetchable by enchantment tutors and can also be fetched directly onto the battlefield for anyone out there playing a Zur the Enchanter Stax deck. Being an enchantment creature also enables Constellation decks that draw cards when an enchantment enters, or if you're in a graveyard deck, this can help count towards Delirium if you want like a Spicy Brew using that ability. I did not expect that the top commander playing this and by a wide margin, is Winota Joiner of Forces. Winota players are likely using this as an asymmetrical piece, as this isn't a human creature, so it can help get creatures onto the battlefield, which is a form of advantage. While you're limiting your opponents to just one draw each turn, you're getting things directly onto the battlefield and thus breaking parity. But I'm not entirely sure. That is just my suspicion. If someone can enlighten me why 55% of Winota decks are running this, I'd love to hear, because that is more decks that are running this than are not. Next up, we have Bottomless Pit, which sees play in 22,500 decks. This is a 3-mana enchantment that costs 1 generic and 2 black, and it says, during each player's upkeep, that player discards a card at random. Nice. This is another resource disruption Stax piece, but this time in the form of hand disruption as opposed to mana disruption. If this were to just say discard a card, that wouldn't be anything spectacular, but it's the randomization of the discard that can cause so much damage. People want to be in control of their game plan. It's as simple as that. So losing a key piece before you were planning to use it is just brutal. If you have ever seen anyone play Burning Inquiry, which, by the way, is just a hilarious card to play in the first place, you know how many groans there are when people discard 3 cards. There's always going to be something that they wanted, and they're like, oh no, they discarded that. So it's kind of like that effect, but without the bonus of drawing 3 cards, and it's only discarding 1, which can still disrupt a lot of plans. This, of course, is being played mostly by discard-focused decks, but even non-discard decks could throw this in there to just mess with your opponent's plans. And if you yourself are fine with getting hit by this, then by all means, try it out and see what you think of it. Now we have Doorkeeper Thrall, which is in 18,800 decks. This is a 2-mana creature that is a 1/2, and it has flash, flying, and artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. So this is like an improved Torpor Orb on a stick, except it also hits artifact ETBs and has flash, which is like the best part about this card. The addition of flash is a huge key piece to this as a Stax ability, because people can just choose not to play their large ETB effects when a Torpor Orb is on the battlefield. They're going to seek removal first, and then they just sandbag their big ETB effects. But with Doorkeeper Thrall, you can flash this in response to someone casting something huge like an Atali. They cast their big ETB effect, then you cast this in response, so it is on the battlefield before the creature spell actually resolves. Then, when it does resolve, this Stax piece is just sitting there, and it makes sure that the ETB doesn't trigger in the first place. This also works against big artifact ETBs like Portal to Phyrexia, but maybe more importantly, this can also stop really popular cards like Orcish Bowmasters from the ETB effect. Thassa's Oracle is a classic ETB, Atraxic Grand Unifier, and also Tishana's Tidebender. And not only does this shut off the creature ETB effects themselves, it also shuts off other triggered abilities of cards that are already on the board. So things like Impact Tremors, Tokasha's Welcome, or Enduring Innocence. Being a creature does make this more susceptible to removal, like I mentioned, but I think it's the addition of having flash and hitting artifact ETBs that makes this a very viable and nice Stax piece to consider. Up next, we have one of my personal favorites, and that is Confounding Conundrum, which is in 14,500 decks. So this is a 2-mana enchantment that costs 1 generic and 1 blue. It says, when Confounding Conundrum enters the battlefield, draw a card. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. So I've been a big fan of this for several years now. There's a few things in particular that I love about this card. One, it's only 2 mana and it draws you a card. So as a 2 mana permanent with a very relevant ability in the first place, that ETB effect in and of itself is very helpful and is a nice bonus, which is why Brago King Eternal, Yorion Sky Nomad, and Abdel Adrian, Gorion's Ward, are the top commanders playing this. Like I said, you're obviously slotting this into your deck for the Stax effect, so the fact that it does draw you a card upon ETB is just a very nice cherry on top. 2, this doesn't get targeted by the entire board, as this is primarily going against the green players and people playing land ramp. Yes, it does affect fetch lands, but this isn't like a Winter Orb that comes down and immediately locks down the entire board. So sometimes people are okay with having this on the board in order to stop the biggest person who is just going to go off if this stays on the battlefield. A third thing is this can help keep the landfall decks at bay. Yes, I know that one of the biggest arguments against this card is that it can actually be beneficial for landfall decks because it can make sure that they have a landfall trigger every single turn. But my argument against that is that landfall decks are going to landfall no matter what. But they can do much more damage and take insanely long turns if they have access to 15 mana instead of 5. When I am talking about this, I'm in particular referring to some things like AC Tyrant of Gyre Strait or Tatiova Benthic Druid. You know, those really annoying commanders that can refill their hands no matter what. You know, so they get lands out, they're refilling their hands, and they can just go on these insane trains. I would much rather prefer to limit their ramp. And yeah, they can have their card draw. They can have access to it next turn, but at least they're not starting their next turn with 15 or 20 mana. They just have 5 lands, just like all of us. However, I do think that argument is valid against mono green decks like an Azusa Lost But Seeking deck that dumps out all of their lands, then doesn't really have a way to refill it. In those cases where half of their cards in their hand was a land, it makes sense. I don't want to give them access to lands every single turn to keep getting their abilities. But yeah, it's tough. I see it both ways, but I'm greatly in favor of using this card over not. One last thing that I'll mention is that this can be played against the new Toph, the First Metal Bender, and other Earthbend decks that are for sure going to be flooding the game here soon enough. But you've heard my take. I'd love to hear yours now. Do you think that this card is beneficial in terms of a Stax piece, or is it too risky in terms of giving someone landfall triggers every single turn? If you are enjoying this video and would like to support the channel, liking and subscribing is always super helpful. I also have a weekly newsletter called the Unpopular MTG Report if you'd like to subscribe there. Or you could just check out the Patreon for access to the Discord, monthly deck building competition deck lists, and more things like the bonus videos that I mentioned earlier. Let me know if you do have any questions, but there are some links in the description. Next up, we have Contamination, which is in 13,800 decks. This is a 3-mana black enchantment that costs 2 generic and 1 black, and it says, during your upkeep, sacrifice a creature or sacrifice Contamination. Whenever a land is tapped for mana, it produces 1 black mana instead of its normal type and amount. This is just an insane mana disruption Stax piece in mono black. Obviously, if you play this, you're going to be targeted by every player who isn't playing mono black. But if you're in the market for this effect, you absolutely know that that's coming your way. I think it's funny to see that the top commander playing this is Turgid, God of Fright. So this totally embodies that super villain persona that I just described. Turgid players, they know that they're not in the market for making any friends whatsoever. So they just embrace it. That mega villain stereotype. And they just want to make other people's lives harder in any way possible. So I respect it. You know, they all in on their decision to be the mega villain of the game. A few quick things about this card. The sacrifice requirement is extremely easy to meet these days, and in many cases is nice to have around in order to sacrifice a creature for free. This does give an opportunity for people to get rid of this by playing board wipes, and if you don't have a way to create another creature before this trigger fires, then yeah, you'll have to sacrifice it. Also, as per the rules of this card, this is a replacement effect as opposed to a triggered ability. So as a result, this is as if the opponent's Gaia's Cradle just said, tap, add 1 black mana. Instead of saying its normal text, then the trigger on the stack alters the amount and type of mana that this produces. So it's a great Stax piece, and what's nice is that when you've had enough of this, you're like, okay, yeah, I don't care about this anymore. You don't have to have some enchantment removal on your own piece. You can just sacrifice it in your upkeep. One other variant of this card is Infernal Darkness, but that has a cumulative upkeep cost, which is enough to deter a lot of people from playing it. Next up, we have Tectonic Instability, which sees play in 5040 decks. This is a 3-mana red enchantment. It costs 2 generic and 1 red, and it says, whenever a land comes into play, tap all lands its controller controls. We have seen some land/mana disruption sack pieces already, and this one is in red. I was going to include this when talking about War's Toll, but I thought that this is different enough that I included it as its own piece. First of all, it is symmetrical, so you are hit by it. And this one is also a nice Stax effect against control decks and interaction decks. This doesn't actually stop people from playing spells and doesn't destroy lands either. They can still tap it and add to their mana pool. So what this does is it makes people have to decide, A, to all in on their main phase, on the phase when they play their land, or B, they just can't play a land on their turn in order to have mana that they can use for interaction across multiple of their opponent's turns. As I mentioned earlier, this type of effect is really good against the upcoming earthbending decks like Toph, because all their non-token artifacts are now lands. So whenever a non-token artifact, which is now a land, comes into play, all their artifacts and lands are tapped, not just their actual lands. The other land tapping Stax piece I was going to mention in this is Rising Waters, which is in blue, and it's only played in 2,800 decks. It's one of those effects that lets one land be untapped in a person's upkeep. We have 3 cards left. Next up is Titania's Song, which sees play in 3,590 decks. This is a 4-mana enchantment that costs 3 generic and 1 green, and it says, each non-creature artifact loses its abilities and becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost. If Titania's Song leaves the battlefield, this effect continues until end of turn. I really like this as a Stax piece. This plays really well against treasure decks, clue decks, or any artifact-based token strategy for that matter. Those treasures turn into creatures with power and toughness 0/0, so they're gone. Even against regular decks, this is a nice Stax piece because their mana rocks are now creatures and have summoning sickness and can't tap 4 mana the turn that they come down. If you do play this in the late game, you can drop this and then follow it up with a board wipe to effectively turn it into a loaded Vandal Blast. Turning artifacts into creatures makes them widely susceptible to that removal and wrath effects that wouldn't normally hit them. This even makes the One Ring lose its abilities, but you should be careful when you do this because this can turn all of their artifacts into beaters, and if you're not ready to block, then this could be a overrun effect for the players that you're playing against. Another use case for this is against Voltron decks because equipment that become creatures can no longer be equipped to the Voltron commander. I was thinking that this would be a very fun card in a Ruxa Patient Professor deck where you play a ton of artifacts to accrue value throughout the game. Then you drop this to animate a massive army of artifact creatures that don't have any abilities now. So they have that anthem that Ruxa gives, and they can assign all of their damage as if they weren't blocked. It's an interesting idea for a mono green deck out there, and so if that does sound interesting, I'd love to hear if you have done something like that before. Next up, we have Portcullis, which is in 2,460 decks. This is a 4-mana artifact that says, whenever any creature comes into play, if there are 2 or more other creatures in play, set that creature aside. If Portcullis leaves play, put the creature into play under its owner's control. So the amended wording for this card, because it is pretty old, is whenever a creature enters, if there are 2 or more other creatures on the battlefield, exile that creature. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control when this artifact leaves the battlefield. So most notably, this exiles the creatures. This one is an interesting anti-creature Stax piece that can lock the board state at the time of playing it. What I do think makes this the most interesting is that obviously it can lock out your opponents from making their board state bigger, and it hurts creature decks or token decks, but this can actually be very beneficial for blink decks because the creature still enters the battlefield and thus they get the ETB effect. And when Portcullis is destroyed or it's blinked, they get the ETB again for free. So they essentially double it up. Allowing creatures to hit the battlefield does make for a pretty interesting offensive tool for maybe an Azorius Stax or Blink deck by locking out the board, playing your ETB effects, then blinking Portcullis to get your ETB effects again, and repeating it by flickering your creature, then to get it exiled with Portcullis and then blinking Portcullis. And so pretty much for every ETB effect, you can get 2 for the price of 1. There are, surprisingly, no Blink-related decks in the top 5. The main commanders playing this are colorless decks like Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter, and Karn Legacy Reforged. But seeing this, that was the first thing that came to mind. I was like, oh, maybe it'd be a fun offensive Stax piece to kind of break the symmetry that way. And our last card of the day is Dense Foliage, which sees play in just 1,280 decks. This is a 3-mana enchantment that costs 2 generic and 1 green, and it says creatures can't be the target of spells. Nice. It's a unique card that can mess with a lot of game plans, actually, both from an offensive and also a defensive perspective. So first of all, this messes with targeted removal, so it makes a pretty much a no man's land where everyone can have huge creatures and huge threats running rampant on the battlefield. This also messes with Voltron decks because people can now not target their creature with auras or buff spells. But notably, this can be good in an activated abilities deck because it only says that they can't be the target of spells, but doesn't mention abilities. So that does include equipment as well. And lastly, this can mess with targeted protection spells. So if someone were to cast a board wipe, they would need to have a catch-all protection spell like Heroic Intervention, because something like a Tamiyo Safekeeping or a single granting Hexproof or Indestructible outside of activated abilities wouldn't work. I think that this could be an interesting form of protection in a mono-green Stompy deck. You can play your huge creatures that would normally eat up targeted removal, and they're largely protected while also messing with your opponent's plans as well. But that's everything that I have for today. I myself am not too much of a Stax player, so it was really fun to see what types of effects are out there and just how underplayed a lot of these cards are. I'd love to hear what you think of this, if there are any key Stax pieces that you think I missed, or if there was a favorite card that I mentioned in the video today. But thanks again, hello from Ian, for suggesting this video topic. I really enjoyed it, and thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you next time.